The helicopter blades were already screaming when the girl's voice cut through the roar. A single sentence that could either save a billionaire's life or get her killed. Raymond Langston's hand was on the door handle when he heard it. A child's desperate shout across the tarmac, sharp enough to stop a man who never stopped for anyone. The airfield shimmered with heat, the late afternoon sun beating against the asphalt until it seemed to ripple underfoot. The rotors of the Bell 429 thundered overhead, their spinning blades slicing the sky with a mechanical whine. Raymond Langston stood beside the chopper, one hand on the polished door handle, his other already adjusting his cufflink in a practiced gesture of control. The smell of jet fuel and hot metal filled the air, the world reduced to wind, noise, and purpose. He had a schedule to keep. He always had a schedule to keep. Then came the voice. "Don't get in the helicopter!" It wasn't just loud, it was sharp, raw and young and desperate enough to tear through the heavy air. Raymond froze. For a second he thought he'd misheard, but then he saw her. A girl no older than 10 sprinting across the tarmac toward him. She looked impossibly small against the sprawl of the airfield. Her legs pumped furiously, bare feet slapping against blistering pavement. Her jeans were frayed, her shirt torn wide at one shoulder, flapping with every stride. Sweat streaked her dusty face, her breath hitching as she ran, but her dark eyes were fixed straight on him, wide, terrified, blazing with something more than fear. Raymond stepped away from the helicopter, arm shooting up in an instinctive signal to the pilot. "Hold," he barked. The pilot's gloved hand moved across the console, and the engine began to spool down. The roar softened to a low growl, but the wind from the blades still whipped at Raymond's tie as the girl closed the distance. "Okay." She stumbled once, caught herself, and kept going until she was right there in front of him, chest heaving, her thin frame trembling from exertion. Her feet were raw and bleeding, toes streaked red where the skin had split. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence around them broken only by the slowing chop of the rotor. "Stop," she gasped, pointing toward the helicopter. "Please don't go." Raymond crouched slightly, still not touching her, but lowering himself enough to meet her frantic gaze. His voice stayed calm, the same calm he used when billion-dollar negotiations teetered on collapse. "Why?" "They did something to it," she blurted out, her words tumbling over one another. "Two men, last night. I saw them near the fence. They opened something underneath and put a black box inside. I thought they were mechanics, but then they cut wires and—" She shook her head, tears threatening but not falling. "You can't get in! You can't!" Behind Raymond, two men in dark suits stood perfectly still, his private security detail. Gregson and Hall, the best he could buy. The late sun caught on their mirrored sunglasses as they watched, silent, giving no sign they'd heard the girl's accusation. Raymond straightened and turned to look at them, something cold unfurling in his chest. Gregson, tall and angular, tilted his head slightly, puzzled but not alarmed. Hall's jaw moved as if he were chewing on the inside of his cheek. Neither spoke. The girl followed his gaze and jabbed her finger toward them, trembling now. "They looked like that," she said, voice cracking. "Same suits, same walk. One of them wore gloves, black ones. It was hot out. I thought that was weird." Raymond's hand dropped from the helicopter door. He had known Gregson for years, trusted him to guard his life, his children, his secrets. And yes, he did wear gloves, always, a small habit Raymond had never questioned. Something in the air shifted. The noise of the airfield seemed to recede, the world narrowing to the girl, the helicopter, and the two men standing like shadows just behind him. "Curtis," Raymond said into the comm clipped to his lapel. His voice was measured, but every syllable carried weight. "Diagnostic sweep, tail number 114. Focus on the undercarriage and nav systems. I want results now." "Yes, sir," came the crisp reply through the static. Raymond looked back at the girl. She was still standing tall, though her scraped knees were trembling. She didn't beg or cry. She just stared at the machine behind him like it was a coiled snake. For the first time in years, Raymond Langston felt the steady certainty of his world tilt, just slightly. And for reasons he couldn't quite name, he didn't dismiss her. He didn't wave her off. He turned his back on the helicopter, the rotors sighing to a halt behind him, and gestured toward the terminal. "Come with me," he said quietly. The girl nodded once, wiped her nose on the back of her hand, and followed him inside. The hot air of the tarmac gave way to the cool echo of the terminal's tiled floor, but the sound of her voice still hung in Raymond's mind, ringing sharper than any alarm. "Don't get in the helicopter." And for the first time in a long, long time, he was glad he had listened. The hum of the rotors had died, but the noise in Raymond Langston's mind only grew louder. He walked beside the barefoot girl through the terminal's glass doors, His long stride slowed so she could keep pace. The receptionist glanced up, startled to see the billionaire arrive with a bleeding child at his side, but Raymond didn't stop. He moved her past the lobby into a side corridor that led to the maintenance office, his jaw clenched, his eyes unreadable. She perched on the edge of a wooden bench, arms wrapped tight around herself, still shaking from the run. Raymond studied her in silence, the image of her raw feet burned into his thoughts. He had seen desperate people before, countless times, in negotiations, in hostile takeovers, even in politics. But this was different. This wasn't desperation for power or gain. This was desperation to stop something terrible. Minutes dragged by until the door burst open. Curtis, the hangar supervisor, entered, his face pale. He carried a diagnostic tablet, the screen glowing with schematics. He handed it over without a word. Raymond scanned the readout and his breath caught. A foreign module had been spliced into the flight computer. Small, hidden, nearly invisible. It was designed to activate 10 minutes into flight, rerouting GPS and shutting down communications. A perfect setup for a crash far from land, chalked up to pilot error. Raymond looked up slowly, his expression like carved granite. "You found it." Curtis nodded grimly. She was right. Someone tampered with the bird, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The girl, Maya, sat very still. She didn't smile or gloat. She simply whispered, "I told you." For a long moment, Raymond said nothing. His entire empire had been built on certainty, on knowing more than the next man, on controlling every variable. But now, in the space of a few minutes, it was a child who had seen what he hadn't. A barefoot child with no reason to lie. The office door opened again. Gregson and Hall stepped in. Their dark suits seemed even darker under the fluorescent light, their mirrored sunglasses hiding their eyes. They stood at attention, calm, impassive, like statues waiting for instruction. Raymond's mind sharpened. The girl's finger trembled as she pointed at them. Them, or men just like them, I swear. Gregson tilted his head, his voice smooth. "Sir, with respect, we've been with you all morning. You know that." Raymond's eyes narrowed. He had trusted Gregson for years, but now the smallest details screamed at him. The gloves on his hands, the too even tone, the perfect stillness. He had built his career on reading people, and now something inside him whispered that this man was no longer on his side. "Curtis," Raymond said quietly, never taking his eyes off Gregson. "Pull the security feeds from last night. Every angle, every second. I want a full review." "We already did, sir," Curtis replied, voice tight. 27 minutes are missing, not corrupted, erased, a manual loop insertion. The silence in the room thickened, pressing against the walls. Raymond took a slow breath through his nose, forcing control back into his body. He turned to Maya. "You saw them open the chopper? You saw what they placed inside?" Her nod was slow, deliberate. "A black box. I thought it was a toolbox, but it wasn't. They hid it under the seat." Raymond's stomach tightened. The exact detail matched the sabotage Curtis had found. His gaze flicked to Gregson, then back to Maya. "You watch everything, don't you?" he asked her quietly. Her lip trembled, but her voice held. "People don't look down. They look over. If you don't watch, no one will." The words struck harder than the diagnostic report. Raymond turned back to Gregson and Hall, his expression unreadable. "Leave us," he said calmly. The two men exchanged a glance. "Valhaz." And after a beat, they stepped out. Curtis shifted uneasily. "Sir, if she's right." "She is," Raymond cut in. His voice was low, final. He turned to Maya. "You've done more than anyone here tonight. You've saved me." He paused, his eyes darkening with something colder. "But this isn't over. Whoever tampered with that machine wanted me dead. And if my own men are compromised..." He trailed off, the weight of betrayal gnawing at him. Maya's small voice pierced the silence again. "They'll try again." Raymond looked at her, really looked. A girl who had nothing, who lived by the dumpsters with her grandmother, and yet she had run across the tarmac with bloodied feet to shout the truth. She had no reason to care about him, but she had, and that meant he had no choice but to care about her. He rose slowly, the decision already hardening in his mind. "Curtis, move the girl and her grandmother under protection. Quietly. No records. No leaks. If those men are compromised, no one outside this room can know where she is." Curtis hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Raymond turned back to the window. The helicopter sat on the tarmac, gleaming under the fading sun. Minutes ago, it had been a symbol of his control, his certainty, his ability to go wherever he wanted at will. Now it looked like a coffin. His reflection in the glass was pale, sharp, edged with doubt. Behind him, Maya's eyes stayed fixed on him, steady despite her exhaustion. And for the first time in years, Raymond Langston felt fear, not of death, but of betrayal. The office felt too small, the walls pressed in, the air too heavy with silence, the faint hum of machinery from the hangar beyond a reminder of how close he had come to climbing into death. Raymond Langston stood with his back to the window, the shadow of the grounded helicopter stretching across the tarmac outside. Behind him, Maya sat perched on the bench, her small hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of cocoa that had long since gone cold. She hadn't moved much. Her eyes flicked between Raymond and the door, watchful, unblinking. Then the door clicked open. Gregson stepped in. Tall, broad-shouldered, built like a wall in a tailored suit. His shoes clicked against the floor with a rhythm too precise, too assured. He shut the door softly behind him, like a man who never needed to raise his voice, never needed to hurry. Hall wasn't with him. That, in itself, told Raymond something. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Gregson's voice was smooth, the kind of calm that in any other moment would have reassured. Now it only scraped like glass. Raymond motioned to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Gregson did, posture perfect, hands resting on his knees, but it was the hands that Raymond's eyes found first. Black leather gloves, spotless, even indoors, even under bright office lights. For years, it had been a quirk Raymond never questioned. Now it felt like a mask. Raymond tapped a control on the desk. The screen embedded in the wood lit up, displaying a schematic of the Bell 429's flight computer. A red highlight pulsed where the foreign module had been spliced into the system. "You recognize that?" Raymond asked softly. Gregson barely glanced at the screen. "Looks like the nav relay, sir. I'm not a mechanic." "She does." Raymond's eyes shifted toward Maya. Her voice was quiet but steady as she said, "That's where they put it, under the co-pilot seat." Gregson's jaw tightened just slightly, not much, but enough. Raymond had built his fortune on reading the small tells, the twitch of a lip, the shift of an eye. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, colder. "Last week you requested access to the hangar after hours, said you'd misplaced a cufflink. You sent Hall in instead. 2 nights later the security feed ran 27 minutes of blank. Yesterday you called in sick and showed up on site anyway. No sign-in, no record. You spoke to no one. You didn't even speak to me." Gregson's calm held, but there was a sliver of something else behind his eyes. A calculation, a wait and see. "You're a loyal man," Raymond continued, his voice measured. "At least that's what I thought. But now I wonder, loyal to who?" Gregson leaned back slowly, his lips curved just enough to be called a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You don't have proof. You have a child's word and a malfunctioning camera system." Raymond stood. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, the way a predator circles instead of pounces. He walked around the desk until he was close enough to see his reflection in Gregson's sunglasses. "Not yet," Raymond admitted, "but I have something stronger than proof. I have instinct, and I have a girl who risked everything to shout the truth." Gregson's smile faltered, and in that instant the mask cracked. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched. It wasn't guilt, it was the recognition that the game had shifted. The office door opened without a knock. 2 plainclothes agents stepped inside, badges flashing in the light. The air changed, sharp and heavy. "Mr. Langston," one said, "we're here on your request." Raymond's gaze never left Gregson. "Escort him out." For the first time in years, Gregson looked caught off guard. He rose slowly, straightened his tie, and glanced toward Maya. His head tilted, almost imperceptibly, as though weighing whether to speak, whether to strike. Then, with a faint smirk, he let the agents take him by the arms. As the door shut behind them, Raymond exhaled. Not in relief. There was no relief yet, but in clarity. The house of loyalty he had built around himself was already cracked, and one betrayal had just walked out in cuffs. But Hall was still out there, and behind Hall was something bigger, something with enough power to pay for sabotage, to plant black boxes, to erase cameras without a trace. Raymond turned toward the window again. Outside, Maya stood under the watchful eyes of 2 staff members. She looked impossibly small against the vast sweep of tarmac, but her chin was lifted. When her gaze found his, there was no fear, only certainty. Curtis entered quietly behind him. "What now, sir?" Raymond's eyes stayed on the girl. The scream still echoed in his skull, the one that had cut through the storm of machines and schedules and ego. "Now," he said, his voice low but carrying steel, "we follow the trail, all the way to whoever thought they could erase me." And as the words left his mouth, the roar of the helicopter seemed to return in his memory, not the machine's threat, but the reminder of how close he had come to never hearing that scream at all. Night had settled over the airfield, the world outside the terminal now wrapped in the dull glow of floodlights and the distant hum of generators. Raymond Langston sat in the operations room below the hangar, a place only a handful of people knew existed. The glass walls vibrated faintly with the sounds of the facility, but inside the room, everything was quiet. Too quiet, like the air before a thunderstorm. Curtis stood at the table with a tablet in hand, scrolling through the security audit report, his face tight. "It's worse than we thought," he said at last. "The blackout wasn't random. Whoever did it knew our system inside and out. Triple redundancy failsafes were bypassed manually. And here," he turned the screen toward Raymond. "They used a loop insertion, sir, the kind that feeds fake footage to the monitor while they work in real time." Raymond's jaw flexed. That meant this wasn't just sabotage. This was surgical, deliberate, clean enough to fool even his best team until the girl's scream cut through the silence. "Who had the clearance?" Raymond asked. Curtis swallowed. "6 people, sir. 2 mechanics, your assistant, Gregson Hall, and you." Raymond stared at the list. 6 names, 6 keys that could have opened the door, and one of them, the man who had guarded him for years, was now sitting in federal custody. "Hall?" Raymond asked without looking up. "Gone," Curtis said grimly. "He disappeared the moment Gregson was taken off the field. GPS tracker disabled, company phone dumped in a trash compactor. He knew what was coming." Raymond leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. Hall on the run meant Hall was guilty, or worse, that someone out there had ordered him to vanish. The door opened softly and Maya stepped in, escorted by one of Raymond's staff. She looked smaller now in the oversized hoodie someone had given her, but her dark eyes still held that unblinking intensity. She held a notebook close to her chest. She'd been sketching again. "You should be resting," Raymond said gently, though there was no reprimand in his tone. She stepped closer, set the notebook down on the table, and opened it to a drawing. 2 figures crouched under the belly of a helicopter, one holding a rectangular case, the other wearing a cap pulled low. The lines were childlike but precise. The posture, the angles, even the way the shadow fell across the ground. "I remember their shoes," she said quietly. "Black boots, shiny, not like mechanics' boots. And one of them, he had a patch on his shirt, right here." She tapped the page, pointing to the shoulder. Curtis squinted at the drawing. "That's not one of ours." Raymond felt something stir in his chest. Not fear this time, but the sharp edge of revelation. "Scan every vendor contract we've had in the last 30 days, he ordered. "Cross-check employee uniforms. Look for that patch." Within an hour, the results came back. A single match. Gigatra Solutions, a logistics subcontractor tied to... Raymond's eyes hardened as he read the name on the screen. Aerogen Dynamics. For months, they had been circling the same federal aviation contract that Langston Aerospace was on the verge of winning. And now, their subcontractor's uniform patch had just been sketched by a 10-year-old who saw what none of his own men had caught. "They tried to kill me," Raymond said softly, the words tasting like steel. "Not just sabotage my bird. They wanted me gone. The room we palmed went very still." Curtis spoke carefully. "What do you want to do?" Raymond turned toward Maya, who stood there silently, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. For a moment, he saw not a child, but the sole witness keeping him alive in more ways than one. "First, we keep her safe," Raymond said. His voice was no longer calm. It carried the weight of command, the kind that made men move. "Get her and her grandmother out of Richmond tonight. No paper trail, no chatter. They stay under my protection until this is over." Maya blinked, surprised. "You don't have to..." "Yes, I do." He crouched to her level, meeting her gaze squarely. "You saw what no one else did. You saved my life. That makes you my responsibility now." She swallowed, then nodded. As she left the room with her escort, Curtis turned back to Raymond. "And Hall?" Raymond's expression darkened. "Find him before they do, because if Hall's still out there, he's either running scared or he's carrying orders to finish what Gregson started." The screen behind him shifted to a satellite map, red pings lighting up across the Bay Area. Hall's last known location glowed like a warning beacon. Raymond stared at it for a long moment, the weight of the coming storm settling over him. Aerogen had made their move. Now he would make his. Above them, the hangar lights buzzed softly, casting long shadows across the empty tarmac where the Bell 429 waited, silent and gleaming. Somewhere out there, the men who had crawled under its belly were watching, waiting. Raymond straightened, his jaw set. "Pull every record, every wire transfer, every contract connected to Gigatra. I want a chain, I want proof, and when we have it..." His voice dropped to a dangerous calm. We burn them down in daylight. Outside, a low wind picked up, sweeping dust across the airfield, whispering like a warning. But this time, Raymond wasn't just listening, he was preparing to answer back. The night broke with the sound of engines. Not from the airfield this time, but from the black SUVs pulling into the Langston estate. Their headlights cut through the fog, beams sliding across the vineyard rows like searchlights. Inside, the main house was lit only by a few lamps. Raymond stood in the study, one hand resting on the edge of the desk, the other holding a secure phone. His reflection stared back at him from the tall window, the reflection of a man who had spent his life outmaneuvering rivals, never imagining the day one would try to erase him entirely. Curtis entered, breathless from the cold. "We found Hall." Raymond turned. "Alive?" "Barely. He was intercepted on Highway 37, running dark. Someone got to him first, shot out his tires, tried to drag him off the road. My men got there before they could finish the job." "Who?" Curtis handed him a tablet with a pause security feed from a highway camera. The grainy frame showed two masked figures fleeing into the marsh, their truck abandoned, its plates covered. "They didn't want him to talk," Curtis said grimly. Raymond's jaw tightened. "Get him here." An hour later, Hall was slumped in a chair in the secure operations room beneath the estate. His suit was torn, blood on his temple where glass had cut him, but he was breathing. Raymond stepped into the room and dismissed the guards until it was just the two of them. "You've got one chance," Raymond said, voice low, controlled. "Who paid you?" Hall's eye flicked up, defiant at first, then broke under the billionaire's steady stare. "Russell Kane," he rasped finally, "Vice President of Systems Integration, Aerogen Dynamics." The name hit the air like a gunshot. Russell Kane, the man who had been courting federal regulators for months, lobbying for Aerogen's navigation system to replace Langston's. "He gave the order?" Raymond pressed. Hall nodded. "Through a logistics broker, Cale Withers. We were supposed to make it look like a mechanical failure over water. No comms, no wreckage recovered for days, just enough to sink your credibility and kill the DOT bid." Raymond said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the hallway like the strike of a gavel. Upstairs, Maya was awake. She sat cross-legged on the couch in the guest house living room, sketching under the warm light of a single lamp. When Raymond entered, she looked up immediately as though she had been listening for his footsteps. "You found him," she said softly. "Yes." Her pencil hovered over the page. "Was I right?" "You were right," Raymond said. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her. "And now we know who's behind it." Her eyes widened. "Are they coming back?" He hesitated. For a man who had spent his life answering every question with confidence, that pause felt heavier than any boardroom loss. "They might," he admitted, "which is why I'm not letting you out of my sight until this is over." She nodded once, not frightened, just resolute. Before dawn, Raymond's estate became a fortress. Federal agents moved in quietly, setting up mobile command posts, scanning perimeters. By sunrise, the vineyard was crawling with unmarked vehicles and plainclothes operatives. Then came the call from Lorraine Greer. "We've got a hit," she said, her voice sharp with controlled excitement. "One of my analysts intercepted a secure message from Aerogen's internal relay, Kane's login. The message reads, 'Test failed, target survived, initiate fallback protocol.'" Raymond's grip on the phone tightened. "Fallback protocol means they'll try again, or they'll try to wipe the trail." "Exactly," Greer replied. "We need to move before they scatter." "Then we go public," Raymond said flatly. "Are you sure? Once we step into the light, you can't pull this back." Raymond glanced toward the window where Maya stood outside on the patio, staring up at the rising sun, her small figure silhouetted against the glass. "They tried to silence her," he said quietly. "They tried to silence me. If we stay quiet now, they win. Prep the press conference. We bring Kane into custody before sundown." By mid-afternoon, the plan was in motion. Federal agents coordinated with Interpol to intercept Kane at a private terminal in Nevada. At 3:17 p.m., confirmation came through. Kane had been taken off his jet in handcuffs, furious but silent. Raymond stood at the window as the news reached him, the sky outside streaked with gold. His chest felt lighter than it had in days, but the battle wasn't done. They still had to link Kane's order to Aerogen's executive board. They still had to hold the conspiracy together long enough to make it public before it was buried in legal maneuvering. Behind him, Maya's quiet voice broke the stillness. "What happens now?" she asked. Raymond turned. "Now we tell the world what you saw. We make sure no one forgets." Maya nodded, her small hands curling into fists at her sides. Good. And for the first time since that scream on the runway, Raymond allowed himself a smile. Not of victory, but of resolve. Tomorrow they would step into the light together.